My name is Garrett Bingham. I'm a sports performance intern coach at Marquette University for the fall 2017 semester, and I will be presenting on Terrain Park Skateboard, which is one of the new Olympic sports for 2020 in Tokyo. So we're going to get started. This is an example of what Terrain Park is. It's sort of the classical skate park that's not the street version of skate parks that maybe you saw in the early X Games. So it's more so what you would actually see when you went to a skate park in your town or in your city. So right now the only real pro tour for this is the Brand Park Series. So they have 5 competitions. You've got a prelim, you've got a final. So you get 4 runs. Depending on the competition, they kind of change the duration. So you have 40 to 45 seconds. Do your run. Try to do the best tricks you can. Your highest score is what moves you on. So it doesn't matter of an average, it doesn't matter on any of that, it's just whoever gets the best one. So you can just fall 3 times, put up an awesome run, and you can make the finals off of that. Prelims and finals work kind of weird, so there's 20 people in a prelim, 6 people get moved on to the final, and then you've got about 10 other people that are already slotted to go into the final. So really, it kind of depends on where you are in the sport. I'm kind of approaching this as somebody who's got to do those prelims to get into finals. It's kind of a young athlete, so they aren't already selected. A lot of those are people who kind of made championships the year before. So it's all based on judging. So degree of difficulty, creativity, combinations, speed, flow, all these things that kind of go into these runs. And the first thing I kind of thought of when I saw what they grade on is gymnastics and figure skating. So people have a tendency to look at these kind of non-traditional sports and think of them as different than anything else they've seen. But at the end of the day, it's all about, kind of execution of technical skills through the use of physical abilities. And it's exactly like these other sports in terms of having subjective grading. So you kind of have to know what the judges are looking at, you kind of have to know what you can do, you kind of have to know how things are weighted. And watching a couple of the competitions, it almost looks like competition to competition, what they emphasize in their judging changes. So you kind of have to know that competition, okay, this is what they're focusing on. The next competition, what are they going to focus on in terms of my performance? And you kind of have to meet those. So you have to be very adaptable while you're going into the competition on what you're going to do. And so you kind of have to really have a good comprehensive knowledge of your sport. Which kind of brings me to this talk from Rodney Mullen. If you're familiar with skateboarding, you should know who this is. If you're not, this guy probably invented 95% of the tricks that exist ever since the advent of the ollie. So he has been multiple-time world champion, national champion, is pretty much one of the guys when it comes to skateboarding. Pretty much street skateboarding wouldn't exist.
So let me give you another example of how context shapes content. This is a place not that far from here. It's a rotten neighborhood. Your first consideration is, am I going to get beat up? You go out and see this wall? It's fairly mellow and it's beckoning to do bank tricks, right? But there's this other aspect of it that for wheelies. So check this out. There's a few tricks. Again, how environment changes the nature of your tricks. Freestyle oriented, manual down, and wheelie down. Watch this one. Oh, I love this. It's like surfing, this one, the way you catch it. This one, a little sketchy going backwards, and watch the back foot, watch the back foot. Oh. Mental note right there, again, we'll get back to that. You hit it back foot, back foot. Okay, up there, that was called a 360 flip. Notice how the board flipped and spun this way, both axes. And another example of how the context changed and the creative process for me and for most skaters is you go, you get out of the car, you check for security, you check for stuff. It's funny, you get to know their rhythms, all the guys that cruise around. And skateboarding is such a humbling thing, man. No matter how good you are, right, you still gotta deal with it. And so you hit this wall, and when I hit it, the first thing you do is you fall forward. I'm like, all right, as you adjust, you punch it up. And then when I would do that, it was throwing my shoulder this way, which, as I was doing, I was like, oh, wow, that's big for a 360 flip, because that's how you load up for a 360 flip. And so this is what I want to emphasize, that as you can imagine, all of these tricks are made of sub-movements, executive motor functions, more granular, to the degree to which I can't quite tell you, but one thing I do know is every trick is made of combining 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 movements. And so as I'm growing up, these things are floating around, and you have to sort of let the cognitive mind like rest back, pull it back a little bit, and let your intuition go as you feel these things. And these sub-movements are just kind of floating around, and as the wall hits you, they connect themselves to an extent, and that's when cognitive mind think, oh, 360 flip, I'm gonna make that. So that's how that works for me, the creative process, the process itself of street skating.
So pretty cool getting to listen to a skateboarder pretty much explain procedural memory development and part to whole learning in terms of physical skill, which is the same thing that I kind of do when I try to put together a program for an athlete is, how do I teach you parts of skills in order to be able to do bigger, stronger, more explosive types of movements, because that's what's going to lead to the greater development of the tissue that's going to allow you to have greater outputs, which then you send them out and you let them skate, you let them do their sport, and they can figure out, okay, this is what I can do here, this is what I can do there. So that's kind of the approach. So where am I going to start? Strength. It leads to power development, it leads to the ability to load eccentrically. 2 things incredibly important with the sport. You have to be explosive off the skateboard, you have to be able to take those landings. The next thing, skill, skill, skill. Skill, skill, skill. It's all about how good you are at executing on the skateboard. So it doesn't matter how strong I get this person, it doesn't matter how much eccentric loading they can handle, it doesn't matter any of that. If I'm taking them off their skateboard, they're not transferring the skill. And that's 100%. This is, you have to have transfer in this sport, otherwise you're not gonna win. And that's kind of the bottom line there. So looking at the year, breaking it down, looking at the Bands Park Series, I get about 20 weeks of off season, and that leads in to the first competition. So my first competition is in Sydney, next one's in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Malmo, Sweden, Vancouver, Huntington Beach, and then the World Championships are gonna be in Shanghai. So all over the globe. Really kind of lends it back to that idea of teaching them how to do these movements with slow progressions, so that when I send them off into the world, they can still keep training, I don't have to be there, and I know they can still do what they need to do. So starting in my preseason, kind of my off season, I'm going to do a return to fitness block. 3 sets of 5, moderate intensity, nothing too crazy, very, very basic movement patterns. Get them to squat. I'm approaching this like somebody who's never done it, because most of these guys haven't. Most of them are 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. They're on this pro skates tour. So not a ton of training at all, and probably most of it is just taking place on a skateboard. So very, very basic movements, just figuring out how to move, squat down, pick something up off the ground, hip hinge, just the basics. Gonna go into a basic strength block, again, staying with 3 sets of 5, ramping up the intensity a little bit more, really starting to actually focus on movements that are closer to what I'm gonna use through the extent of this training period. Strength endurance block, this is where I'm looking for both work capacity and hypertrophy. If you see these guys, they are tiny. They are very, very little, and it's to an extent good for them because you want to have a good strength power ratio, or body weight to power ratio. You want to be able to be very explosive for your size and be able to move yourself around, particularly on aerial and sort of flipping type tricks. So again, fairly basic movements, 3x10, just looking for some cross-section area, some work capacity as we go into some of the other, higher intensity lifts in the next block, which is our intro to max strength. We're going to go into a front squat here, mostly just to introduce it and to offload just a little bit of that loading of the spine, because we did back squats for 10s in the last block, and there's a lot of loading there. So we're going to unload that a little bit. Plus it introduces that front rack, and you also get that a little bit with your strict press. But keeping a back squat in on that Friday, because next block, guess what, we're back to back squat. We're going into a push press now, so we're starting to shift towards a little bit more power development from just strength development. You can see the same thing on the Wednesday. That's the day you're going to see change the most. This day is going to be boring for the most part. It's my heavy push day. I'm going to do presses, I'm going to do squats, I'm going to do some sort of bench press, I'm going to do some sort of secondary lower body push that is probably going to have some sort of progression. So I went from front foot elevated split squat just to kind of introduce that, get range of motion, into a drop lunge to figure out how to start moving with that weight now, because again, hasn't really resistance trained, doesn't know how to move with a load, kind of just knows how to move. Absolute strength, 3x5s again. This is going to be a little bit heavier. Starting to now introduce my push jerks in as down sets on my push press, so that I can go into push jerks in my next block. Again, that same kind of concept that you heard Rodney talk about of putting things together slowly, and then you can put 1, 2, 3, 4 together, you can do more complex movements. Now starting to move a little bit more with those lunges, getting a little bit more of that activation for that unilateral stability. Not something I put a huge emphasis on, because I feel like the strength you get from the back squat handles a lot of that better than trying to unilaterally load, just because of the intensities you can work with. But again, here you see a progression. Now we're moving into power clean. This is my last block before we go into season. So now we're really starting to concentric, concentric alterations in those movement patterns. So concentric with your pull, eccentric with your receiving, concentric standing back up with it. So now we go into season. This all rolls into end of this block, Sydney, first competition. So after Sydney, now we're rolling into Sao Paulo, so going into that. Going into push jerks, med ball toss, we're in 3x3s now. We're gonna put in a little more contrast type stuff. So something that's fast and loaded with something that's fast and less loaded or unloaded. Just to be able to hit more of that force velocity spectrum, the load velocity spectrum in the training, expose them to greater power outputs. That's gonna be a 5-week block, so it's gonna function very traditionally. Most of my blocks are load, 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 unload at the end, or use the next block first week as your unloading block. Malmo, this one is going to be a little bit different. You can see I go back to a push press. That's because I'm going back into 5s. I've got 7 weeks, and this is kind of the last time I can throw a bunch of volume back on them before I just kind of let them go for the rest of the year and just keep intensity in there and focus on the skateboarding. So go back into 5s. Doing a little bit different in terms of what I'm doing. Oh. Wrong button. So doing my clean grip counter movement shrugs, high power output there, complexing that with a mid-thigh clean to keep that bar turnover in the program. But now I'm starting to introduce snatch grip with a snatch grip shoulder shrug. One, because traps are like the calves of the upper body. They don't really help this guy that much, but they're gonna look good. So that'll be fun. Plus, we're gonna go into snatch grip movements in the second half of the season. So to introduce how to hold that bar, where that bar should be hitting you, how to move with that bar in that position can be introduced with something as basic as that, while you're still keeping that triple extension movement of the lower body in with a more familiar exercise. Vancouver, now we're getting towards the end of the season. Now we're moving into snatch type movement. So more explosive, lighter loaded, but you inherently can bring volume load down because you can't do as much weight, but you can really push power output because of how fast you have to move that bar to get the displacement you want. Starting in this block, I'm now going to continue to kind of deload some of that with dropping my back squats into half squats. So coming off the pins, trying to move it fast, but then keeping back squats in as a down set. So still maintaining strength through a full range of motion while improving power output from a position that the athlete's actually going to be in a lot, which is going to be more of an athletic crouch position. They're not going to get all the way into that deep squat that often, but you still want to keep the strength there, because if they do, you want to make sure they can stay stable. Going into World Championships, this is a 7-week block, but really there's an overreach and a taper in the last 4 weeks, so it's going to function like a 4-week block with this stuff all the way through the overreach, and then going into the taper, going to drop off pretty much everything but the quarter squats and push jerks on Mondays and Fridays, and then do snatch grip counter movement shrugs and then ball toss for heights on Wednesday. So intensity, neural activation is all still very, very high, but the total volume you're doing that leads to fatigue and slow down degree of force development is pretty much going out the window, because we're selling out to try and hit world championships as good as we can and try and be as explosive and dynamic as we can. But mostly just gonna skateboard. Gotta be on the skateboard, gotta be feeling as many different environments as I can, really starting to understand what tricks I can do in this situation. If I take this run, how can I sequence things? Because at the end of the day, they need one incredibly good run to become a world champion. And if they're just pretty good on most of them, that's not good enough. So you have to have them be able to skate through that park and figure out where's their best run. What tricks are they most confident in? What part of the park can they do that in? And then once you start to kind of put together those anchors in, here's my 2 best tricks, here's where I can do them, how do I seam a run together that includes those 2 main tricks, but also the transitions you need to kind of get from A to B to make sure you put together the highest quality run. So every type of skateboarding, vert, street, everything, there's not Rodney Mullen again, just kind of balancing on the nose of his skateboard, because he spent so much time on there that he just has complete control of his body while he's on the skateboard. Some incidentals, other things they're going to throw in. Mobility, of course, is going to be kind of important. You still kind of want to be stiff for those eccentric properties, but you still want to be able to move around. There's a lot of flipping of the board and things like that and spinning it. So you need to make sure you have the mobility to get out of the way of that board, because if it hits you in the leg, you're not going to land back on and you're all just going to crumple to the earth. So we want to avoid that. Something like yoga to just build in low intensity days. So everybody should be familiar with Charlie Francis and kind of high-low training. You want to build that in. So these are kind of ways to do that. And that's kind of how I'd use them is, okay, you've had 3 or 4 rough days. Let's take a day where you do yoga, or a day where we just work on mobility, or a day where you just do some like low intensity bike or rower or running tempo work, or take you to a trampoline park where your actual loading isn't that high, but you can kind of work on aerial type work. A lot of the indoor kind of parks that have like the foam pits at like gymnastic gyms where he can, do flips and things like that to practice being in the air but not have to really deal with any sort of loading from the landings, or things that we can kind of stick in there on those like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sundays where he's not in heavy training, and kind of allow him to do some other things and still keep him active so his training load doesn't get too low, but also doesn't incur too much loading on those days to where he's just going to be sore all the time. That's all I've got. Questions? Yep.
So since you said like they're mostly like younger athletes and they haven't really lifted before, how are you gonna like get them excited to like come in and like work hard?
I think you would be surprised how excited young athletes that have never done this before are. Like I have a canoe kayak athlete that I've worked with for the last 2 years, and we got him when he was 16 years old, and he is like the responsible adult of those kids, and the rest of them are like in their 20s. He's the one who's making sure that he comes in every month, and he's the one who's dragging everybody else with him to Charlotte. When you put together like a very basic program, and you're kind of like, this is going to make you better, and it doesn't take a ton of their time, most of those younger athletes are very receptive to that. Not to say 100%, but in my experience, like we've had a lot of younger athletes that once you give them that, because they, like most athletes, they just want somebody to care. Like if you show that you care enough to put something together and be like, hey, this is what you need to do to get better, there's a lot of buy-in immediately.
Sort of building off that age question, since you are working primarily with younger athletes, are a lot of these athletes still going to be in school, or are you going to be building around sort of that classic school schedule?
Most of them will be in school, but at the same time, my program is going to be maybe an hour a day, 3 days a week, and the rest of the time they're going to be skateboarding. The travel is a little bit in the way of that, but most of the competitions are on weekends and kind of happen over halfway summer and then kind of into the semester. World Championships just happened, I think, last month. So a lot of it is kind of over the summer period. Anything else?
Got a couple. Firstly, similar to Cameron's question in a way, in that in preparing for this presentation, in the research that you did, like how common it is strength and conditioning for skateboarding athletes like right now, and like is anyone in your research like stood out as this person who really buys into it, or this is a coach that's kind of known for working with these
Honestly,
athletes?
didn't even really look into it that much. I'm not a what are the Joneses doing type of guy. I've been lucky enough that almost, with the exception of like the NCAA athletes I've worked with almost exclusively non-traditional type sports in terms of canoe, kayak, and bobsled. So I kind of understand. Then almost everybody I grew up with were skateboarders, and most of them I still know are now people who lift a lot of weights. So I think there's sort of this initial reaction that people want to be like, okay, this is a non-traditional sport, and so let's treat it non-traditional, but it kind of comes down to that same aspect of you don't treat female athletes different than male athletes, you treat them like athletes. And I don't, even if there's people that are like, oh, well, this is the sport I work with, it's non-traditional, you're still just coaching an athlete. And so I just kind of look at it that way.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is like a underserved population in terms of they could benefit, or more people could benefit from strength conditioning?
Absolutely. You look at these kids and they're, 120 pounds and tiny, and you see what they do, and it's a lot like gymnastics and figure skating. And figure skating, one of the things I kind of drew off of was one of my mentors worked with figure skaters when he was at Colorado Springs, and they were incredibly strong for their size. Like they had girls that could hold on to dumbbells equal to their body weight and do a box jump. Like that's, so if you just treat them like athletes, it still kind of goes into it. But I do think it's a sport where the skateboard culture and like the coaching training culture are just so separate, and generally you don't have a lot of people that are, especially at the ages people are competing at now in this sport, that are also engaged in like high school sports where most people kind of get their first introduction into that kind of strength conditioning, resistance training type of stuff. So I think it's probably just more so a cultural thing, but I wouldn't be surprised, especially now that it's an Olympic sport, to see more of that coming up, because you see that now with surfing and snowboard and ski and all those other sports that used to be extreme sports. I mean, Bill Sands is working with snowboarders now, and that was a sport where when I was a kid, that was Winter X Games, and you never would have thought, one of the greatest sports scientists and strength coaches in the history of the profession would be working with snowboarders. But he was one of the best to ever do it with gymnasts, and you kind of look at the two sports and you're like, well, this guy could probably figure out how to do a snowboarder training program, because it's kind of the same basic skills.
Mm-hmm.
So you say like they're not traditional athletes, like not in a high school setting, they're not getting like introduced to strength and conditioning like at that age. So how would you go about like finding like a skateboard athlete and like asking them like, okay, would you like to start like strength conditioning coaching?
I think I'd probably like go to the events and wander around in the parking lot and be like, hey kid, let me see you squat.
Okay.
And if it looks good, give me my card.
Yeah.
Last question I have would be, obviously, like you say, like your final slide was like really nice in the fact that it's such a skill dominant sport. Like they have to be able to skateboard, obviously, and as with every sport, we're more of a support role. But with something like track and field, it's clear to the athletes that, especially throws, for example, like mass, absolute strength, rate of force development is going to translate into their distance and their throw. But a little bit muddy in the waters with these kind of athletes in that sense. But my main question is like with when they have like on a skateboard with triple extension to leave the ground through an ollie or whatever it might be, or off a ramp, the rate of that kind of counter movement or the plyometric function is kind of slow in a sense. It's not like a really kind of quick movement. It's kind of like a dip and then drive type of thing, and they use the ramp and use the skateboard to help with that elevation. So did you have any like considerations in terms of like that kind of stretch shortening cycle, how it might be a little bit different to say a triple jumper who's hitting the ground hard and coming off the ground quickly versus, you know, skateboarding?
I mean, I didn't really think about it that way too much. Just kind of most of what I'm going to do in training is just build the basic capacities. So teach them how to use the stretch shortening cycle through counter movement type activities, squats, things like that, and then develop size and strength abilities. And then for the actual specific sport skills, like you notice I didn't put a ton of plyometrics in because I'm taking this as year one as somebody who's never done it. So a lot of those things that are very specific to the sport, I'm leaving out of my training program because I want them on the skateboard. So they're getting it there. So the resistance training is very much a base level, your ability to generate force. There is some stretch shortening cycle in there with the push press, push jerk, counter movement, shrugs, things like that. But at the end of the day, the temporal changes that you see in their sport versus what I'm doing in the weight room are things that they're going to adapt to through doing the sport. And so I'm not going to try to program too much of that. Same thing, eccentric loading is important, but I'm not going to eccentrically load them a ton in my first year of the training program because they're already getting that feeding and that pounding in all of the skateboarding that I'm going to tell them, you should probably go do this. You should go spend a couple hours, just skate around and find different parts of the city that you can try different tricks and learn new things. And so I'm going to kind of avoid over-prescribing that in mine because I know it's going to be coming in. It's sort of that, you know, when the trainer does one thing in the training room, doesn't tell you, and then you do the same thing in the weight room, and now you've sort of overstimulated and you've overworked them and you get overuse issues and things like that. So it kind of this, rather than trying to get too specific in the weight room, I'm going to build generality and then use them developing their skill to sort of dial in the physicality they need.
Any further questions? Good job.